G'day mate, welcome to Factorio with me, G'day. So this is the second video in my introduction to Factorio series. By all means, if you missed the first video, you can always click up in the top right hand corner. There'll actually be a link to the playlist that starts back at the first episode where we cover a lot of other parts of the main menu. But this one is all going to be how map generation works. We're going to do one whole video just on how map generation works because honestly, if you get a bad map, it's probably going to ruin your experience, and I really want you to have a lot of fun with this game. I have probably close to 10,000 hours in this game because I've got to say, it's probably the best $30 I've ever spent. Anyway, with all that said, I'm going to roll the intro now. So the first thing we should actually cover is the very big green button at the top, which is continue. Continue just selects your last save game. So it could be whatever you've saved the game as. Also, it could happen to be an autosave. It's a really, really great feature the Factorio devs have thrown in, and it just jumps you back to whatever the last save was. So that's a quick and easy one out of the way. Next we have single player. So single player has new game, load game. Obviously we're going to go for a new game. There is the tutorial there. I'm not going to actually cover the tutorial in this video. I might cover it in a second video. As always, there is a link down in the description again for a full playlist for other quick tips and tricks videos like this one. But we're actually going to cover free play because that's really what Factorio is about. It's about the free play experience. It's about building your factory without any other constraints on you apart from your own time and, you know, maybe sleeping and eating. If you've recently bought this game, you're going to find very, very quickly that it is very, very addictive. Anyway, in there, we can bring up our first real introduction into map generation itself. So first thing I'm going to actually do is I'm going to bring up the preview button. So this shows me what the current map is going to look like. So if I click play, I would get this exact map. So it's sort of giving me an overview. Now we have a couple of buttons up here. We have a random seed button, which we can click. You know, if we don't like what we're given first up, we'll start with that one because it's a complete desert. We also have a couple of other options up here. We can, you know, have a default map, a rich resources, a marathon, which makes some of the recipes more expensive. A death world, which turns the biters up. I do not recommend this for a new player. I do really recommend you start the game and you probably play it once all the way through. With some alternate biter settings. Death World is fairly challenging. I'll put that out there. I have done my own Death World series where I cranked it up to about a scale of 11 quite recently. I'll link that up in the top right hand corner if you want to see what a Death World can look like. We also have a Rail World. A Rail World preset basically moves the ore generation further out and gives you large patches, larger patches. We also have a Ribbon World. So Ribbon World is short and wide, again different type of challenge, and then an island where you have one island. That is it. It has to be done upon this one island. So we're going to start with the default. I'm going to start playing with these sliders. So all these sliders affect the different types of ore generation. So we have iron, copper, stone, coal, uranium, and crude oil. Really, iron ore you're going to need a lot of. That's sort of what Factorio is really about, having as much iron as possible. Copper, you're going to need a fair bit of. Stone, you don't need a lot of. Coal, you'll need a lot to start with, but then as you work towards later in the game, you probably won't need nearly as much. Uranium, honestly, you don't really need that much. I don't think in a single game I've actually managed to mine out one of these patches entirely. Crude oil's sort of different to all the other resources. It's technically infinite. What happens when you get a crude oil patch is it starts off at like, you know, an efficiency of 100%, and then as you drill out the oil for longer and longer periods, it drops that efficiency from 100% down to maybe 10%, and then sort of stops there. So it's technically unlimited. You should never run out of oil, but as I said, we'll go through some of the sliders. So frequency is how common something is. So as we can see, we've got iron up here, iron down there. If I slide the frequency right the way up, we can see we have extra iron patches we didn't have before. Same with size. Size is pretty self-explanatory as well. If I drag that up, all the patches become larger. Richness is something different. This patch, for argument's sake, might have 1 million ore in it. If I slide that up, the patch is not going to get any bigger, but it's going to become more dense. So it's going to last for a longer period of time. If it's your first game of Factorio, or you know you've had a couple of tries and things haven't gone well, I do recommend that if we reset this back, you probably bump the richness up on all of these just a little bit, along with the size and the frequency. Just give yourself a little bit of an extra advantage having larger patches that don't run out as often, along with having a couple of patches that are slightly closer to you, or more frequent with slightly larger. You know, none of these settings will hurt you, but they can definitely help you help ease the transition into learning how Factorio works, the mechanics of Factorio. Okay. Next one I'm going to jump over to is the terrain. Now, this one is a little bit weird. So it says scale and coverage. Think of scale more like zoom. So at the moment you can see it's 100%. This is our starting water. So you're always going to have water right where you start. That's used for your very, very first power. So your water extraction into your boilers, into your steam engines. So excluding that one, if I bring the scale down, it's more going to zoom out. Okay, actually that's our starting water down there. So it more zooms out. So if I scale this up, you'll see, this lake basically zoomed in on the area. That lake's becoming bigger and bigger, but you can see all the land masses themselves. The shape of the map doesn't change. It's more like a zoom. So what you can actually do very, very early when you're actually going through the map generation is bring this all the way down and say, okay, am I happy with that amount of water? If I'm not, I can bring the coverage down and have smaller water masses. By the same token, if you want a little bit of a challenge, you can actually drag that all the way up and have lots of little large water masses, and you have to end up winding your factory through them. And then if you can say, yep, I'm happy with that, you can drag the scale back up to 100%, and you sort of know what the rest of the map looks like. It's going to end up being either lots of land masses or lots of water masses and small islands being joined together. So that's how those two work. Trees, same story. If you slide the scale up to 100%, I have no trees whatsoever. That didn't really help. We're on a desert map. That's why. There we go. That's something with trees. So these are trees out here. If I drag the scale right the way up, you can see I actually have less trees. If I drag the scale right the way down, I have many, many, many small patches of trees. So it sort of works in reverse, where you end up with many, many small patches of trees that can, meet up with one another. Let's go with a halfway point. So you can see, this is a little forest, that's a little forest, that's a little forest. If I scale it the other way, I won't hit a forest often, but when I do, they're going to be quite large. So, that's a large forest, that's a large forest, that's a large forest, that's a large forest. Coverage works pretty much the way you'd assume. If you scale it all the way down, you don't get that many trees. If you scale it all the way up, you're going to end up with nothing but trees, which is great for your pollution. The catch is they're a little bit of a nightmare to dig through. So that pretty much covers the trees section. Cliffs on or off. I recommend you play a game with cliffs on. They're an interesting feature. Most players can't stand them. Again, frequency, if you turn it all the way up, you end up with lots of little cliffs everywhere. The continuity, if you slide that up as well, you'll find your cliffs. If you look through here, our cliffs are continuous. If we slide it all the way back down, you can see that there's lots of gaps in our cliffs where we can walk through, run belts, all that sort of stuff. Cliffs are quite handy because they're impenetrable walls, so they're very, very good at creating a natural defense to keep biters out. A lot of players, after they've played with cliffs once or twice, they end up turning them off. Again, it's a personal choice thing. Next up, we're going to cover the moisture and the terrain type. And these ones are actually going to cover backwards. We're going to cover the biased first. Now, the moisture, it really covers, when it comes to the bias, it covers how much greenery is on the map, being to a certain extent trees. As you can see, this forest here and this forest here, they both get a little bit larger, a lot larger, depending on how high you turn that bias. I really, really recommend for your first game, your first couple of games, especially if you've got biters on and pollution, really recommend for your first couple of games, really look for a green map. Do not look for a desert map. Desert spreads pollution a lot further and a lot faster. So it's something you need to keep in mind if you have biters on, because obviously they are attracted by the pollution. So as we can see with the bias here, if we turn this up, even though it was predominantly a desert map to start with, we get a lot more greenery. If we turn it all the way down, we get a lot more desert. If I hit it sort of a halfway point, when we actually come over to the scale is how often these biomes will change. So as you can see, this is like a green lush grassland. This is like a dirty grassland. This is less grass over here. If I change the scale up, you can see we transition more often, much, much more often. If I drag this all the way down, you can see this has become just one large biome. The biomes really don't affect the game too much. You can play on complete desert, one single terrain type. You could just concrete the world if you really, really want. When it comes to the terrain type, same sort of story, but this just seems to affect the desert. So if we bring the bias all the way up here, we can see that that There is less variety in the deserts, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. And same story if we go over the terrain type option. If I drag that all the way down, you can see that these desert biomes are much larger. If I drag it all... No. If I drag it all the way up, all these desert biomes are much larger. They don't really change terrain or change biome types nearly as often. If I drag it all the way down, you can see there's lots of itty-bitty little transitions between one terrain type and the next. Same story, if we drag that all the way down, we can see it really, really affects the desertness of the map. Rather than the greenery of the map. So that really covers those two. We're going to reset everything default. That's what that red button up there does. Next, we're going on to enemies. Now, of course, we have biters on the map. This is a default map with default generation. We'll get to the biters first. First off, we have the starting area size. So the starting area size is, if you're starting here in the middle of the screen, what's the distance to the first biter bases? In this case, that looks a little bit close. Definitely for your first map, I would probably scale this right the way up and say, hey, yep, 600% is a really good number. That way, your first biter bases are all the way over here. Because we have expansion on, as your gameplay continues, they will expand and have a new base here and a new base here and a new base here, and they will start getting closer to you. So you can always turn the starting area all the way up for your very first game and then go from there. By the same token, if you really make your life as unbearable as possible, you could turn the starting area down to 17% and you're literally going to find out you have biters starting pretty much on top of you. Again, for your first game, I really, really don't recommend this. This is really a video for new owners of the game Factorio. So for your first game, probably slide that up to the 600% mark. Now, as for the enemy bases, the frequency and the size, same story as before. Frequency gives you many, many, many biter bases. Lots of bases can be very, very interesting if you want to play a Death World. Again, first game, I don't really recommend it. On the other side, you can turn the frequency right the way down, and as you can see, they are few and far in between. Size is pretty self-explanatory. You can either have really big bases or really almost non-existent bases. Is that a none setting? Nope, it's at 17%, 17%. In theory, they should be on the screen. Nope, they should be here somewhere. There's one right the way up there. So they become very rare and very uncommon. Normally, for your first playthrough, I'd probably leave them on and turn on peaceful mode. Peaceful mode means they exist, but they won't attack you until you attack them. Really, for your first ever real playthrough of Factorio, I'd recommend either turning off the biters, it will disable the achievements, or turning on peaceful mode, which I think will disable some of the achievements. Not all of them, but it will disable some of them. So that's something I'd really recommend looking at. And then we have we have enemy expansions. Enemy expansion controls how far they're going to move from their existing base before starting a new one. Obviously, we can slide this right the way up. So you might have a base from back here, start another base here and another base there because it's within their zone. Along with minimum and maximum group sizes, that's for setting up new expansion parties. That's not for attacking parties. Minimum cooldown and maximum cooldown, again, same story, affects how often each and every single biter base can do an expansion calculation. It's not all the biter bases combined, it's every single individual base. So again, first playthrough, maybe turn that off. There's nothing stopping you turning that off. It means you don't have to deal with biters expanding. You can just kill them off once, and once they're cleared out from an area, they're cleared out from an area. By the same token, if you don't want to turn that off, just turn the cooldown all the way up and make sure they can't expand very far. So they literally have to start a base very, very close to where their existing bases are. It will sort of lead to a mega base situation where you have this base has started a base beside it, and you end up with very, very large bases over time. But again, after you've teched up an awful lot, bases become a lot more easier to deal with. Evolution. So you have time factor, destroy factor, and pollution factor. So time factor you really won't have to worry too much about. Generally, the biters don't evolve that much due to the time that you're playing the game. They do evolve very, very heavily when you start attacking their bases and taking out the spawners, which stop new enemies spawning. That will vastly affect how quickly they evolve up. And then pollution factor, obviously the more pollution they eat, the quicker they evolve. Same story, you can slide these right the way up if you really, really want a challenge, or you could slide these really, really all the way down if you want to make your life a little bit easier. So last tab we have is the advanced. So there's a couple of settings in here. We have a width and a height of the map. So we were looking at the ribbon world before, which as you can see has a height of 125. If we go back to our default map, you can set a height here. So you might want to have a height of 1,000 and you end up with a map that's just 1,000 tiles high. Or you can set it to not 0, obviously. So you can set this width and height to whatever numbers you want for a ribbon map. Recipe difficulty, you have normal and expensive. Normal is the normal way that Factorio runs. Expensive means a couple of core intermediate recipes are a lot more expensive. I honestly don't recommend you play with expensive, not till you've played through once or twice, and even then, as an experienced player, I can tell you it's not a lot of fun. You're probably better off looking for mods rather than playing with the expensive mode, because the things that the game changes have a immediate effect in early and mid game, but by the time you get to late game, they really don't matter anymore. Technology, difficulty, normal and expensive. Again, same story, I suggest normal. Expensive can be a little bit interesting. On top of that, you have a price multiplier. So you can decide that rather than your first research costing 10 packs, you can change this to 2, and then your first research is going to cost 20 packs, so on and so forth. Can be a different challenge, can be a different type of gameplay. Honestly, 9 times out of 10, look on the mod portal. There are some very, very, very good mods if you want to change up the way you're playing Factorio. The last one we're going to really cover is research queue availability. After you've launched a rocket, you can enable a research queue that lets you pick out the next 7 researchers, and it'll just run through those researchers one after the other. I honestly really, really recommend that you turn this on right from square one to always. It's an option the devs were ahhing about turning on and off for new players right from the get, well, for a number of months now, and I honestly recommend turn on always. That way you can stop, look at the tech tree, go through and pick the next 4 or 5 technologies you'd like to unlock, and then from there, they'll just automatically research. Once they're done, if you change some other settings inside the game, which we're going to cover shortly, the technology window will pop back up and say, hey, it's time to pick research again. Lastly, we have pollution. So this is the pollution modifier. You need to have this on to enable achievements, but you can do a couple of things if you want to manipulate how the biters work. So if you want to have biters on, but you don't want to turn on peaceful mode, you can actually turn on the diffusion ratio, and you can set this all the way down to 0. So what that actually means is anywhere you're creating pollution, it doesn't spread to anywhere else. So it becomes very, very localized. It also means that it's not going to spread far enough that it's going to affect a biter base that they're going to end up actually coming and attacking you. So that is another option if you want to have the challenge of, if you're out exploring and the biters and you happen to wander too close to the biters, they will come attack you. But generally, they're not going to come attack your base. So that is another option. We have, as you can see, there's little blue icons here that tell you all the different options, or try to explain what the different options are for any of these dialogues, being it pollution or anything else. You can change these up and down. So obviously you can change how much trees and tiles absorb pollution. You can set that all the way up, all the way down. Attack cost modifier. This is how much it costs for a spawner to, how much pollution that a spawner has to eat to actually create a biter. So normally, say it's 100 pollution units for one biter, you could set this down to 50%, at which point it needs to, the spawner only needs to eat 50 pollution units to create a biter, or you could set this all the way up to 400%. Obviously now it needs to eat 400 units of pollution to spawn one single biter. It means you can manipulate how hard you want the game to be. If you go over to a death world setting, you can see this is automatically set to 50% and all the biter bases become much larger. Lastly, we have minimum damage to trees and absorbed per damage tree. So trees over time will end up dying if they're in a pollution range. You can drag this right the way up, and it means they'll still absorb a significant amount of pollution even when they are damaged. Same story here. You can set how much pollution they need to absorb before they start taking damage. You can slide that all the way up or all the way down. So that really covers all the settings when it comes to creating a new game. Obviously, we have a play button down here. There are 2 more: record, replay information. So you can set up a replay, which means that you could go back and rewatch how your game has progressed from the start to wherever you're up to in your save game. In saying that, if the version of Factorio changes, you lose the replay information. If you add or remove a mod, you also lose the replay information. On top of that, the replay can only be played from the start to the end because it's in a sequential order. So there is no rewinding. You can only play forward, and you can play forward at, I think it's up to 64 times normal speed. Lastly, we actually have 2 more options down here. We have an import and exporting map string. So once I click on here, I get this lovely string in here, which is all gibberish to you and I. But if I copy it, I can then change this to a rail world for argument's sake, click the random seed 5 times, have something entirely different. But I can actually come back here and I can paste back in the map exchange string that I had before, which will change back the seed number, reset all the settings to exactly how I had them. So this is really good if you want to have somebody play the exact same experience you have. It's something I've done a lot of my series in the past. I actually include a map exchange string along with a copy of the save game at the start of the first episode, so people can jump in and basically play the exact same game I'm playing during one of my Let's Play series. With that said, we're going to click play, and obviously it's going to throw us straight into the game. We have a quick look on map view. We can see that this is the map that we're looking at in the preview before. We obviously have our coal, our iron, our copper, bit of extra copper, a little bit of stone, a couple of little patches of uranium, with touch more coal over here beside 2 biter bases. With all that said, that's where I'm actually going to end this video. As always, as I said before, down in the description, top couple of links be a couple of playlists. One to the playlist for brand new players, along with another playlist for other tips and tricks videos that I've done in the past that's still very, very relevant. And just below that, you should find a link to our Discord. There are many, many wonderful, talented players on our Discord. If you have any other questions, anything you can't work out, want an extra hand, by all means, jump on our Discord server, ask around. We're all happy to help you. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching. Do hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right. Bye.